Sir, you're not. Sir, we should start now.
Yes, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Today we'll be presenting on the Cuban Revolution. The group members are Giselle Nelson, Gabriel Osborne, Daniel Ashley Smith, and Chantel Banton. Okay, so the economic measures taken by Fidel Castro, which contributed to the survival of the 1959 Cuban Revolution. So we have trade interactions with the USSR, nationalization, and agrarian reform. Okay, trade interactions with the USSR. So in May 1960, diplomatic relations were established between Cuba and the USSR. So the USSR stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and it was comprised of 15 republics such as Russia and Ukraine. The Soviet Union committed to purchase 425,000 tons of sugar in 1960, and from 1961 to 1964, 1 million tons of sugar from Cuba annually. Furthermore, Nikita Khrushchev granted Havana 100 million US dollar credit at a very low interest and promised to sell oil to Cuba below world market prices. This enabled Cuba to once again rely on its sugar industry to anchor the Cuban economy because of Russia's guarantee of a stable market and further economic aid. As a result, Cuba became nearly totally dependent on the Soviet Union link. All things considered, developing trade interactions with the USSR contributed to the success of the revolution. Nationalization. So Fidel Castro nationalized 3 US banks in Cuba, a US-owned electricity and telephone company, as well as US oil refineries. The revolutionary government on October 24, 1960, authorized the nationalization of the remaining 166 US properties in Cuba. These properties included insurance companies, chemical companies, mining companies, hotels and bars, etc. So nationalization is the process of transforming privately owned assets into public assets by bringing them under the public ownership of a national government or state. The US controlled Cuba's economy, so when Castro came into power, he implemented the nationalization program and immediately put an end to American dominance in Cuba. Under Batista's leadership, he forged an early alliance with the United States. The Americans own 90% of the telephone and electricity services, 50% of public transportation, 40% of the raw sugar industry, and 90% of the banks. All things considered, nationalization contributed to the survival of the Cuban Revolution. The Agrarian Reform. So the agrarian reform is a type of
Stop
land
there
reform.
for me. Stop there for me. Go to the other slide, the previous one, the one on nationalization. All right. So you see where you have on the link, where you have a link from under Batista to banks, all of that is part of the explanation. So it should actually be on the explanation. So the only thing that is your link is all things considered, nationalization contributed to the survival of the Cuban Revolution. All right?
Yes, sir.
Because that's part of the explanation. Go ahead to the next one.
So agrarian reform is a type of land reform, and this was the first one. Three more reform acts came after this. So this was an economic measure taken by Fidel, which contributed to the survival of the Cuban Revolution. So the common man benefited from the agrarian reform of May 17, 1959, that facilitated the distribution of land to small peasants, farmers. They could also access economic and technical aid through the various associations that were created. So the 1959 Agrarian Reform Act, this, which is land owned by major American cattle ranchers, sugar and tobacco estates companies, were seized without compensation and made the property of the government. Castro then proceeded to redistribute it in smaller parcels to landless locals at the rate of 27 hectares per family. So this reform law eradicated land estates and foreign ownership. Um, the new revolutionary government introduced the first agrarian reform law as one of the first major structural changes of the revolutionary era. Next slide. So political measures taken by Fidel Castro.
All right, go back to agrarian, the point on agrarian for me. The same issue, you're putting your explanation in your link. All the link is asking you to do is to link it to the question that was asked or to the point that you would have discussed. So it's basically stating your point in a different way. So from the agrarian reform law to standard of living on the link, all of this here is part of your explanation, right? In fact, yes, part of the explanation. And you could use maybe the Agrarian Reform Law of 1959 as part of your example, but you'd have already mentioned that the reform took place on May the 17th, 1959. So I would put what you have here as part of the explanation. And then what you have as where the star is, the new revolutionary government introduced agrarian reform laws as one of the first major structural changes of the last part. So for that, that is your link. That would be a link. All right.
Okay,
But
sure. Can you yourself in please using the waiting room?
Oh wait, I'm in.
go ahead for me.
Wait, I should start where the slide is at. Did you guys start reading?
Yeah, you can start from here. Just do political.
Okay, so political measures taken by Fidel Castro, which contributed to the survival of the 1959 Cuban Revolution. So he petitioned for the overthrow of Batista. He had a measure which controlled the press, and he introduced a new form of government. So firstly, one political measure put in place by Castro that contributed to the success of the revolution was his petition for the overthrow of Batista. And this is seen when Castro openly challenged Batista by submitting a petition to the Court of Constitutional Guarantees, accusing the dictator of violating the Constitution of 1940. Batista, who led a corrupt dictatorship that involved close links with organized crime organization and the reduction of civil freedoms of Cubans, was significantly damaging Cuba's economy, citizens, and future. Therefore, Castro felt the need to petition for the overthrow of Batista and his corrupt government officials and corrupt government. Batista had earned himself the reputation of being corrupt, dishonest, and a terrible leader who prioritized the enjoyment of free-spending Americans over his own citizens who were living in extreme poverty. By petitioning for the overthrow of Batista and successfully doing so, Castro dispelled one of his biggest threats that ensured the survival of the revolution.
Stay on that point for me, please go back. Again, from Batista to revolution, that is part of the explanation. And then where you have therefore Castro felt the need to petition for the overthrow of Batista and his corrupt government official and corrupt government, that would be your link.
Sir, like that's how we always used to do it, but like based on the explanation for link, I just kind of felt confused.
Link is just restating the point in a different way, or linking it back to the question.
Okay, because the day that you were explaining it, you kind of said for the point, when you link it, you're going to say, how did such and such point lead to such and such? So that's why, but okay.
All right, and then the next thing, go back to the next one. If you are discussing about the Batista's way in which he petition is good, but the July 27 movement is another important evidence that it could use.
26, sir.
Huh?
26.
Yeah, the July 26, sorry, the July 26 movement.
Okay, sir.
All right, go ahead for me to the next one.
Control of the press. One of the political measures Fidel Castro put in place that contributed to the survival of the revolution was the control of the press. And this is seen where the Cuban government controlled newspaper advertisements, radio broadcasts, and banned certain books. The Cuban press had been heavily consolidated. The only surviving newspapers were those directly controlled by the government, and even those were limited to a great extent. Through the press, Castro was able to appeal to Cuban listeners and to a very large extent leave a lasting impact on them, as persons generally tend to believe and advocate for whatever the press produces. This heavily controlled press contributed to the survival of the revolution by further winning over public opinion, informing listeners and watchers, and by influencing the minds of the population at large. One political measure implemented by Castro that contributed to the survival of the revolution was his introduction of a new system of government. With Cuba becoming communist, one of the fundamental principles was collective ownership. So, when Cuba came to power, all private properties were nationalized and owned by the government. Additionally, the government owned and controlled all factors of production. This helped effectively redistribute wealth, provide jobs, and demolish American domination. This is seen where open corruption and oppression under Batista's rule led to his outing in January 1959 by the 26th of July movement, which afterward established communist rule under the leadership of Fidel Castro. Since 1965, the state has been governed by the Communist Party of Cuba. The US had gained a position of economic and political dominance over the island, which persisted after it became formally independent in 1902. This led to open anti-US feelings among Cubans. Therefore, by implementing the no private property rule, Cuba was able to control her resources and factors of production and dispel American influence. The introduction of a new government contributed to the survival of the revolution because the Cubans were tired of the strong US influence, and Castro introduced newness which benefited all Cubans by job creation and security and by ensuring that wealth was properly distributed.
All right, thank you very much. The only issue I'm having with the presentation is the link. So all the link, what you have as the link should actually be part of your explanation. So I'm going to give you an example how to link. So the question, you're going to the exam and you get a question, explain 3 economic reasons taken by Fidel Castro, which contributed to the survival of the 1959 Cuban Revolution. Your point is one of the economic measures was nationalism or nationalization, right? And so when you are linking it, you can say, therefore, one of the economic measures taken by Castro was nationalization. You're just rephrasing it, right? Because you're linking it back to the question, linking the point back to the question. No explanation supposed to be in the link. In fact, the link is supposed to be 1 or 2 lines, nothing more than 1 or 2 lines. All right, so that was a good, very good attempt. So we have N, Bartley, Bud, Curry, Irons, and White.
Good morning, everyone. This is group 2, and we'll be presenting on the Cuban Revolution. So here we have a picture of Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and some of his other revolutionaries. So explain 2 economic measures taken by Fidel Castro, which contributed to the survival of the 1959 Cuban Revolution. So one of the first economic measures was the implementation of the Agrarian Reform Act. In May 1959, the first agrarian reform law was introduced as one of the first foremost organizational changes of the revolutionary era by the new revolutionary government. 73.3% of Cuba's accessible farming land was concentrated in the hands of just 9.4% of landowners by 1958. The reform eradicated latifundos, municipalized all foreign-owned rural assets, transferred land to campesinos who had formerly operated it without titles, and accumulated a state-owned agricultural sector to maintain control of around approximately 1/3 of domestic farmland. Additionally, the government also implemented a supply distribution model at this time in which they provided province with agrarian supplies to allocate among state and cooperative forms. This system aided in ushering in a use of high technology, high input farming techniques, which thus improved agronomic infrastructure and increased production of sugarcane and large-scale crops. The implementation of the agrarian land reform ensured the survival of the Cuban Revolution, as foreign-owned industries and plants in the country were now placed under the revolutionary government, making it more accessible to the Cuban people. Secondly, the nationalization of the country's resources. Nationalization of the country's resources established compensation for the nationalized properties through government bonds at 2% per annual interest, with payment to begin in a period of no less than 30 years. The law mandated that the National Bank of Cuba create a fund that will be fed by the Cuban government deposits in an amount equal to that of 25% of the value of the US purchase of Cuban sugar in excess of the sugar quota. Additionally, on October 24, 1960, along with 18 chemical companies, 28 insurance companies, 11 hotels and bars, 7 metallurgical companies, and 15 machine importing companies, the remaining 166 US properties in Cuba were nationalized. This Cuban viewpoint is evident in Law 851 that was emitted by the revolutionary government on July 6, 1960. The law authorized the president and the prime minister of Cuba to nationalize US properties by means of a joint resolution. The law therefore proposed a communally advantageous resolution linking reparations for nationalized properties to the US-Cuban sugar trade by means of a higher US sugar purchase and the Cuban use of the additional income to finance reimbursement and invest in industrial development. The Cuban government also nationalized a US-owned electricity company and a US-owned telephone company, along with oil refineries and 3 US-owned banks stationed in Cuba. Late. The nationalization of the country's resources meant that Cuba now had control over all foreign-owned businesses, which led to the increase in funds for the economy as foreign-owned companies were now government-owned. Consequently, this economic measure ensured the survival of the 1959 Cuban Revolution. Now, explain 2 political measures taken by Fidel Castro, which contributed to the survival of the 1959 Cuban Revolution. The first political measure is the dismissal of corrupted government officials. Hundreds of Batista-era agents, policemen, and soldiers were put on public trial and accused of human rights abuses, war crimes, murder, and torture. About 200 or so of the accused persons were convicted of political crimes by revolutionary tribunals and then executed by firing squad. Others received long sentences of imprisonment. With the previous government officials gone, Castro appointed fellow revolutionaries such as his brother Raul Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara, who ran the new government under fair and just conditions. Citizens were now able to vote for municipal representatives in their provinces, and each elected member would sit on the Revolutionary Committee. Additionally, the Revolutionary Committee would now elect the ministers and the prime minister and the president and the prime minister. Sorry. Late. Fidel replaced the government officials in Batista's reign with his own governmental officials, which aided in the survival of the revolution as corruption had affected the Cuban population adversely. The second political measure implemented was the establishment of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the USSR. With technical assistance of the Soviet Union and Cuba was able to receive an electric power supply system. They upgraded 156 sugar mills and constructed nine new sugar mills. They revamped various communications and TV facilities. They built a nickel concentrate processing plant, and the Cuban armed forces were almost entirely equipped with Soviet weapons and systems. In 1961 to 1991, the military equipment shipped to Cuba from the USSR was worth well above 15 billion. The additional solidification of ties with the Soviet Union and interchanges towards the reestablishment of ties with other countries constituted the elements of the rapidly changing picture of Cuba's foreign relations during the first half of the 1970s. The USSR and Cuba maintained buoyant relations in political, military, scientific, and cultural fields. The Soviet Union also conveyed a wide range of products and goods to Cuba, including spares and military equipment. The establishment of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the USSR as a political measure by Fidel Castro contributed to the survival of the 1959 revolution, as through these relations, Cuba was able to receive urgently needed military and provisional equipment that would have otherwise been inaccessible. In summation, here are the economic and political measures by Fidel Castro. So 1, we talked about the Agrarian land reform, which sought to break up large land holdings and redistribute land to those peasants who worked it and to cooperatives and the state. Nationalization of the country's resources, we said that it contributed to the improvement of economic funds in the country as foreign-owned countries were now governmental properties. And for political, we said the dismissal of corrupt government officials. What do we mean? We mean all corrupt government officials were removed from office and put on trial, many of whom were executed and or exiled. Establishment of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the USSR, we said this led to the improvement of technological, military, and provisional equipment in Cuba. Now we have a quote from the man himself, He said, the equal rights of all citizens to health, education, work, food security, culture, science, and well-being, that is, the same rights we proclaimed when we began our struggle, in addition to those which emerged from our dreams of justice and equality for all inhabitants of our world, is what I wish for all. This is the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening.
All right, good presentation. It was peeled properly. Uh, I think so. Your group and anyway, leave that alone. The next group, Austin Lawrence Miller, Senior, Cranston.
Sir, I ready for get for throw shade, you know? See? I shade it ready for throw, sir. I shade it ready for throw. I'm not
You
pretty sure.
know, sister, ready for church.
And then I'm gonna say, no, I'm not going back to do that. I thank the Lord for resting on your heart.
No. Brianna? Is Brianna here? Sir, wait, 1 minute. Okay, so good morning, everybody. Sorry for the noise in my background. Hearing me properly, sir?
Yes, we're hearing you.
Okay. So good morning, everybody. This morning we'll be presenting on the Cuban Revolution, and the group members are me, Brianna, Zeta, and Annalise at Cranston. So the first question we got was to explain two political measures taken by Fidel Castro which contributed to the survival of the 1959 Cuban Revolution. So the first one that we have was that in an effort to have a successful revolution after Batista fled from Cuba in exile, Fidel Castro replaced many members of the country's governing body. The example is that many of the senior government officials were dismissed and faithful members of the Revolutionary Party that Castro knew were added. In Cuba, during the time of Batista's regime, its political system was filled with corruption. This corruption stemmed from affiliation with the United States, who wanted to control Cuba, and also the avariciousness of its government officials. Furthermore, in order for the Cuban Revolution to be successful, Fidel Castro had to remove all those persons from the country's government system to stop them from making heinous decisions that would continue to negatively impact the country and the people. Consequently, Fidel Castro aided in the survival of the 1959 Cuban Revolution by taking out corrupted government officials and replacing them with honest and law-abiding members. The second one was that following the year of severely strained relations between the United States and Cuba, on May 1960, Fidel Castro declared himself to be a Marxist-Leninist. He begins to implement social problems designed to improve the standard of living for his people. New affordable housing schemes were built for the locals, and the road work started as early as 1960. Sir, for this one, sir, I think it could go under social as well. I don't know if... Sir?
I'm here.
Oh, I was saying that I think it could go under social as well, but I'm not really sure. And then in a televised address on December the 2nd, Castro declared, "I am a Marxist-Leninist and shall be one until the end of my life." He also noted that communism would be the dominant force in Cuban politics. There cannot be 3 or 4 movements, he stated. Some question Castro's dedication to the communist cause, believing that his announcement was simply a stunt to get more Soviet assistance. Castro, however, never deviated from his declared principles and went on to become one of the world's longest ruling head of state. As a Marxist-Leninist, Castro believed strongly in converting Cuba from a capitalist system in which individuals own means of production into all property and wealth are commonly owned instead of individuals.
All right, so what you have in terms of his televised address, when Castro declared that he was a Marxist-Leninist, that would be the example, right?
Oh,
That would be part of the example, I should say, because it is showing example when he would have declared himself a Marxist-Leninist, all right? That
yes,
would be
sir.
the example. And you could include that, you could also explain that part of Marxist-Leninism is social reforms, which includes the things like improving the standard of living for the people and the affordability of housing. All right?
Yes,
But
yes, sir.
that's the only thing that needs to be fixed there. Continue.
The next one was explain two economic measures taken by Fidel Castro which contributed to the survival of the 1959 Cuban Revolution. So the first one was that due to the success of the revolution and the removal of Batista's regime in 1959, Fidel Castro implemented the Agrarian Reform Law. This law prohibited ownership of more than 400 acres, which is 995 hectares, 400 hectares, which is 995 acres of land by either an individual or company. Land taken from United States was distributed to peasants at a rate of 27 hectares per family. During the Batista regime, the United States owned a large portion of land in Cuba. However, after Batista fled and Castro was now the leader, certain changes had to be made. And so in 1959, all land owned by major American cattle ranchers, sugar and tobacco estate companies were seized without compensation and made the property of the government. Thus, it is evident that the Batista regime was an unfair and outrageous one, but with the arrival of Fidel Castro's government, the Agrarian Reform Law was introduced. The second one was that another economic measure taken by Fidel Castro, which contributed to the survival of the Cuban Revolution, was the introduction of the interveners on November 1959. In March 1959, interveners were established to oversee the operations of several American phone companies, including the Cuban Telephone Company, which we all know that was owned by the United States, and the Compañía Cubana de Electricidad. The interveners were required to monitor the U.S. companies and ensure that their services were extended, their charges were reduced, and that they paid their taxes. This was needed due to the US's distasteful and unfair power in Cuba's economy. Hence, the introduction of the interveners in 1959 was an economic measure to provide jobs for Cuban people. I have a third economic measure, but I don't sure if it's spelled correctly. So I don't know if you want me to read it or if you want to read it and tell me.
Go ahead.
Oh. So on February 30 in 1960, Cuba signed a trade agreement with Russia. This agreement stated that Russia could purchase 5 million tons of sugar over a 5-year period, and they supplied Cuba with technicians as well as oil and arms. Khrushchev, who was a Soviet Union politician, declared that the Monroe Doctrine was dead and suggested that it be buried so that it would not poison the air. The US was outraged at the violation of their Monroe Doctrine, and so they warned Russia. The US refused to refine crude oil coming from Russia, So with Castro signing this agreement, the Cubans were no longer had to depend on the US for oil, which was one step closer to Castro's reign over the US. So with the signing of the agreement with Russia, the United States were outraged, but Russia eventually took over the sugar industry in Cuba. So
My issue with this is the explanation is good. The example, you see, what you have as your point should be the first line under your example, and then you basically could say that another economic measure taken by Castro was the signing of a trade agreement with Russia. You understand what I'm saying?
yes, sir.
Because the evidence is the date when it was signed, or the example was when it was signed, although you explain the trade agreement in the example.
Yes, sir.
All right, so the presentations thus far, very good feeling from the groups that presented today. And when we meet on Monday, we're going to go through paper 2. And on Tuesday, we are going to go through paper 1. And on on Thursday, you're going to get an activity to do, individual activity online.
Sir,
Go
is it the
ahead
one
for
that
me.
you sent to us?
Repeat.
Sir, you sent one to us.
Which one is
Is
that?
the one for Thursday? You sent the activity already.
Yes, so you can work on it. That is the activity that you're going to do next Thursday.
Sir Zeda said that I must tell her that she's at school.
All right, good, good. Wait, school physically?
Sir, I think she's doing her orals at school. They can do it at school if they want.
Oh, I never know that.
Sir, I will like physical school.
Who is that?
Giselle.
Oh, you're not going to be there physically?
No.